In the midst of an archaeological dig in Venice, Matteo Borrini, a forensic archaeologist and anthropologist at Florence University, happened upon a horrific discovery in the midst of exhuming and identifying plague victims buried in the 16th century. Unlike the other bodies around her, the remains of a woman who had died in her 60s now had a massive brick forcibly pushed into her jaws. Why was this done? What threat could a 60-year-old woman have posed in death that caused her fellows to abuse her remains in such a way? But what if this woman wasn't a mere mortal, but had transcended humanity to become one of the undead, and the only way of stopping her ceaseless rampages on the living had been to place a brick in her mouth to prevent her from biting? Could the superstitious townspeople of Venice have actually stopped a vampire? We're going to be exploring this and a little more on tonight's episode of Friday Night Frights, where we discuss one of the more popular creatures of the darkness in the vampire. I'm your host, Christian Ashley of Systematic Geekology. We are the priests of the geeks, and I am here to terrify and instruct you on all the weird, unusual, fascinating, fantastical, and unexplainable things that may or may not lurk out there in the world. Just as a reminder, for those of you who've been following, remember last month we did the Loch Ness Monster for cryptozoology. Had a lot of great responses there from people as my watch goes off. That's lovely. So thank you for your engagement there. I had a ton of fun doing it. That's why we're doing this again. This time for our schedule, let me just tell you, we will be doing one video a month for our YouTube page on Friday Night Frights. We're starting with cryptozoology, like we did last time with Loch Ness Monster. Today we're doing the paranormal and the vampires. Next will be religious strangeness, and I'll explain what we're doing at the end of this video. After that, the month after will be the weird and the unexplained. Then we'll do true crime and ufology, and after that, we'll cycle right back to the very beginning. So, thank you all for joining me here. We're going to be exploring a bit more. So, vampires. What the heck are they? Well, we look here at our boy Varney. That is Varney and not Barney. Varney comes from the 1800s. He's one of the first vampires that are written about in fiction, even before Dracula. We have other popular ones up in that place, as well as Carmilla and Lord Ruthven. This kind of the point of explaining what is a vampire, what are the characteristics of this creature. Well, it's going to be very difficult because, as often happens as time goes on, the true definition of what constitutes something, especially in this modern age when it comes to mythological figures, due to cross pollination of ideas that are all just being amalgamated into what we perceive as the vampire, we don't know because everything just kind of jumbles together. And there's no one clear, like, this is the actual example of what a vampire is supposed to be. So, for the sake of this program, we are going to build a concept of what a vampire is and use all those contradictory characteristics to create the image of what we're going to be portraying this evening. So, vampires need to feed on blood in order to survive, whether that be due to it being the only kind of food that they can sustain them to keep them alive in their undeath, as it were, as contradictory as that statement is, or because of the sacrilege it causes to defy God in order to drink what some would argue is the purest form of life. At the end of the day, for a vampire to be a vampire, they need to drink blood, take it from a substance, whether that be animal, human, or something else. And we'll also see here that vampires will typically have very prominent fangs in order to properly feed on on the arteries of the necks of humans and have a powerful and precise enough bite to gain what they need without otherwise harming the skin, normally leaving two bite marks. This would distinguish them from, let's say, a werewolf attack or a zombie attack in that regard. So that's something there for them. Vampires also need to sleep or rest during the day because they die in direct sunlight. Now, this is a controversial pick because it is a fairly new addition to the definition of what a vampire is. And in fact, we go to our boy Count Orlok here for my friends out there in the film world watching a not what's the word I'm looking for here? Not licensed version of Dracula with the serial numbers filed off that still got them sued into oblivion by, I believe it was Bram Stoker's wife, who was very unhappy that they were making this without giving him the credit and paying her money. So, providentially for us, even though all the film was ordered to be destroyed, we still have pieces left over. It's a fantastic film. Go check it out, Nosferatu. So we also see one of the typical characteristics of the vampire here. In this film is the first time we see in especially pop culture of a vampire succumbing to sunlight. So the idea that they need to sleep or rest during the day because they die in direct sunlight is not always true. And like I said, it's more of a recent invention, very popularized within Nosferatu. In fact, if we look at the Dracula novel, the Count himself is able to be in sunlight, but as Harker is able to tell us, Harker, yeah, or Helsing, yeah, either one. Sorry, blew my mind for a second. I couldn't remember characters in Dracula. What he says is that his power is weakened during the day, but he's much stronger at night. So he's a little out of his element during the day, but he can still move around and interact with people. We also see here another part of the mythology is that they must rest in the ground of the land where they originated from, as it ties them to who they used to be. There's a lot of debate on like, why is this part of the mythos? I mean, you can argue from a more meta perspective of like, well, if I'm designing these characters, I need for them to have a weakness or something that hinders them so that they just don't overtake the world. And there's certainly other aspects of the vampire that definitely do that. Others think it's that tie of evil that brought them to the point of becoming a vampire in the first place. That's why they need something from that section of the world where they were in order to continue living. As we see in Dracula and several other stories, like he brings parts of his homeland with him so that he sleeps during the day using that as part of the ritual there, as part of the mythology. Also, we see vampires require an invitation to be allowed inside a house that they do not own. This is an idea that's generated from this folk belief and idea of what thresholds are. Now, everyone knows what a threshold is. That's you just enter a room in that fashion. But in the more metaphysical, supernatural sense, a threshold is there to protect the family from harm and prevent supernatural beings from entering as they please. I mean, one justification it also gives that to nerf the idea of what a vampire or a member of the fair folk can do is they're just that powerful. Something needs to stop them from attacking someone while they're sleeping. And this would be that obvious rule patch in that regard. Some people would say this is a gift left by God. It's like, hey, as long as you're within the confines of a home that you are making holy by serving me, same thing with the church or something like that. That means nothing can get in there unless you invite it in. In the same way that evil and sin could be said to be addressed in that very similar manner of if we just lose ourselves along the way and we invite that sin into our lives the same way that they couldn't pass that threshold until we say yes to it. So that may also be a reason to why that's part of the vampire mythology. And speaking of Christianity, one of the things that repel and can kill vampires, this has been part of the lore for a very long time, but it was even more popularized as soon as we got to the printing of Dracula and then movies came along and brought people to this point. They can be repelled by Christian religious items like the crucifix, rosary, and holy water, but also by silver and garlic. Now, why those two? Silver is something that's really more associated with werewolves and is a very recent addition to the mythos of the vampire lore. Although, like, at this point in time, if I remember correctly, it's one of the Hammer films, and I'm a big Hammer guy. You don't know what that is? Uh, Peter Cushing, and sadly not Vincent Price, by the way. That's very shocking. You would think he was in there, but Christopher Lee, very horror films made by Hammer Productions starting in the 50s. They may have done a bit before that, but like Hammer really started pumping them out in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And they've done some since then, but not nearly in the same rate that they used to. In one of the 70s films, like Dracula had just been killed in so many different ways, so they introduced the idea of silver being something he's not able to take, and he's killed by like a silver knife or something like that. It's been so long since I've seen the movie, but that's where we are there. For silver as well, one of the other reasons people think silver is something that vampires are weak against is because it is one of the things that crucifixes are sometimes made out of. So you double up on the religious protection given by God, but also with the silver there. And there's another reason as well. Citation needed for some of this. I didn't look fully in that part. But the reason vampires can't be seen in mirrors is because sometimes silver was used in their making. They would be behind the glass. And another reason, this is also something that's fairly recent. I want to say it's like Dracula 2000 recent, for those who've seen that movie, is because of the 30 pieces of silver given to Judas for his betrayal of Jesus being used as it's being used as this example of an anathema to traitorous beings like vampires and werewolves. And that's why silver has power over them. So that's silver. Moving on, we go to garlic. Now, garlic, you go, why garlic? I mean, it gives you bad breath sometimes, but why would that be effective against vampires? Well, the reason is back in the day, garlic was used not necessarily as a cure all, but it was used in a lot of home remedies and medicine and stuff like that. So it is very associated with life and healing. So you get to that aspect of is this a form of not exactly a tulpa, but the idea of humanity creating something because we have a belief in it, and that makes it powerful because we think it does. And it's even used. I was reading in one of the books I used as a source here of churches in Greece who would they would eat garlic in each other's presence back in the 1600s, 1700s. And it was either Greece or somewhere in the Balkans. I can't remember off the top of my head, where they would eat garlic in the presence of one another to make sure neither one was a vampire. So this was once again, it was one of those ideas popularized more at past that point of Europe and the rest of the world, with Bram Stoker using it in Dracula as a means of repelling the Count, while Mina is down for the Count at the moment. There's a pun there I didn't intend. Vampires as well cannot cross running water, and this is a bit. It's a bit of a superstition of how we look at water itself, and it being this purifying essence, as well as the fact that it kind of, in a lot of folklore and mythology, cancels out magic and the supernatural. It's just an attribute we give water to because of what we know about it and the fact that it cleanses, the fact that it's always rushing forward and stuff like that. That this is something they can't do. So you see, like the only reason Dracula is able to travel from Romania to Britain, and I still need to see the last voyage of the Demeter. I've heard it's really good. Is he's in his coffin, and that is enough of a separation for him to survive the long sea voyage from Romania all the way to Britain. Vampires as well have an attribute to where they can turn into bats, wolves, rats, owls, moths, and foxes, amongst other creatures, but they also possess the ability to turn into mist to escape harm. And finally, as well, how do you kill a vampire? Well, they can be killed by decapitation, stake to the heart, silver weapons, or by being burned to death. I mean, a fair amount of those would kill a regular person, but it's more the special means of doing so. Like decapitation prevents a vampire from using its vampiric brain to reconstitute itself and heal itself. In the same way, stake to the heart, well, even in its undeath, it requires those organs in order to survive. The silver weapons, once again, it comes from that idea of silver being something repellent to any traitorous being. And being burned to death, well, the very few things out there that aren't going to die when you burn them. So that's where that comes in. So we go here, and one thing I should mention is we're not going to go through every single form of vampire across the world, of which there are dozens. So I've narrowed it down to five for tonight. And we go first, we'll go to the Bri- Bricolacus. Bricolacus. That is, and let me double check something real quick. Nope, wrong one. We'll stay here with good old Count Orlok. The Bricolacus is a being in Greek lore, folklore of a type of revenant. I'll get to that in a second after I finish the sentence. And they're kind of a prototype for what vampires would eventually become. There's a lot of debate on the origins of the word vampire. More than likely, you're going to find someone say it's of Russian or a Balkan kind of organ, Slavic in that sense. The word Uber, something like that, was then translated to other languages until we got vampire. And as those of you who study language know, like it's a wild ride. Like how we got some of the words we have today come from corruptions of other words. Just in English alone, forgetting other languages for a second, of how they get words introduced to their systems. Like the English language is the illegitimate child of a lot of other languages. I mean, you want to go very basic, we have, you know, Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, German, uh, and then there's actually the English that existed with the Angles and the Saxons, and then you get Old English, Middle English, Current English. It's a hodgepodge of wild ideas. So we're not entirely sure where it comes. There's even some debate too of whether or not it's a Turkish word that originally meant, if I remember from my studies, of like a witch or wizard or something like that, and then it was corrupted as time went on to become this meaning of this other being. So a revenant. What the heck is a revenant? Well, you'll find it in a lot of folklores around the world. The word revenant specifically is more in the British Isles, a kind of idea of a person who was dead and is reanimated, and is it is then possible for them to take revenge on those who harmed them in life beforehand or that they didn't like, and family members, they're jealous that they're still alive and they're not. So the Vricocolas, Vricolicus, I've said that probably 16 different ways tonight, is this special being that this it is in this reanimated body, and it steals the life from people by coming to them in the night, feasting off of their blood and their life force. Now, I should mention earlier, why did I not include things like psychic vampires and empaths and stuff like that? That's a whole separate issue. I'm not trying to cover every single aspect of vampirism here. In fact, if that's something you guys want me to do, feel free to leave a comment below on the video. I'm more than happy to do more research on that. It's a very fascinating subject. Also, I'm not covering real life killers right here for vampires. What is his name? Vampire Sacramento, whatever it was, and uh, Dusseldorf Vampire. It's more true crime stuff, and I want to keep that contained there. And if I get those names wrong, I apologize. That was just right off the cuff of what I was trying to say. But going back to the Rokolicus, it was even possible in the lore for them to live among people and father children and have families with no one being the wiser. It's like, look, they were obviously dead, but they could move to a different village, or they could pretend like, oh, nope, nope, that was someone else who got buried. And they would join families, uh, somehow be alive enough to have children, and then move on, like no one else being any the wiser. So that's another thing that kind of separates them from our more modern interpretation of vampires. The idea of them having children is something that only happens a select few counts of vampires as well. We get the idea also from Slavic belief of the Dhampir, that is the vampire who is able to have relations with a woman that comes with a child, and later on that child is born half vampiric, half human. For my Blade fans out there, that's how we get him. So off track there. But the Bricolicus, how does it come into being? Well, there's three reasons most people give And the first being is that they were somehow cursed by a family member to prevent them from entering into the afterlife. And this is like, hey, you're going to be this revenant on the earth forever, and you don't get to go to eternal glory, or you don't get to that point of reaching hell because I think the earth is enough of a hell for you, would be some justification for that. The second is because they may have committed such a sinful act that they were denied true death. So this would be like a kinslayer, or in some interpretations. Oh, and by the way, I do need to give a PSA here. There will be some discussions on the topic of suicide very briefly, and if that's something that is something that might not be very helpful for you to hear right now, you can leave this video. I have no issue whatsoever with that. I would rather you keep yourself a little more mentally well than to listen to what I have to say on that. But it is part of the lore of some of these vampires, is that committing an act like that was enough for them to become an undead. And it kind of speaks to the way to how the church viewed that sin as well. Of it was just that bad. It was so evil in their eyes that if you did this, unspeakable things would happen. You would cause further harm. You were better off not killing yourself and just, going to church and stuff like that. And there's there's ways that could be said better. There's ways that could be a lot better handled, because obviously we want people to live. We don't want people to suffer through immense grief and all this to the point where they think the only way out is to end their own life. But the church historically has not done a really good job at doing that well. So we'll go back to the third reason. And the third reason is that perhaps they just died in a very particularly violent fashion or were not buried properly. It's very important, especially in these European cultures, that you were buried properly. There was this idea that if your body wasn't, kept after well, then you wouldn't be fully resurrected into a new form. And yeah, it's a false belief, but you can see how it happens. So it doesn't matter where your body's at. Jesus is Jesus. He's going to get you out of there. And as Christianity grew more in Greece, like I said earlier, more other explanations like suicide and being unbaptized were added to the list of what could possibly make you uh, Vrikolikas. And in fact, in Greece too, I mentioned Nosferatu. There is a term there known as nosophoros. And I wish I had thought this before I said it out loud, but of what it actually means. But it's this essence of stealing life from something else or being a plague to people. And that's where Nosferatu comes from. So Greece, very important for your vampire lore. Elsewhere, for our next option, and I do have the photo for this, is the Nachzehrer. This is another form of the revenant vampire trope. The Nachzehrer comes from Germany, and its name means he who devours after death. There are some forms that say Nachzehrer, not being night. Nachzehrer is the preferred one without the T, and that means something completely different. But the Nachzehrer itself typically seeks out other family members and friends and systematically wipes them out, just that angry at their continued life and his undeath. And after it's done, it typically crumbles to dust, depending on who you're listening to in the mythologies. But also, as well, a Noxera was typically created when someone, once again, the idea of committing suicide, or they had a horrific accident that left them unfulfilled in life. So they had to come back, but their goal was twisted in this way for them to become this unholy creature. And as you see, especially in the European Christian folklore, this is one of the things that keeps happening, is this idea of remaining behind as this revenant figure and causing death and destruction because your life wasn't fulfilling, or you had such an injustice done to you, but it got twisted into something else when you came back from death into undeath. To stop the rampage of a Noxera, The families and friends of the person in question would usually have to band together and destroy its body while it rested during the day. So, a very difficult task, but something, there's always in these stories of that moral lesson at some point in time. And that being like a community is only as good as its people joining together. A family is only as united when they're loving after each other, loving one another, and then taking care of one another. Now, I said always. Let's go to our next creature this evening, and that would be the Yara-ma-yha-who. This, I'm sorry, I I completely forgot I added this. Um, this is not supposed to be there. I thought I took this off. So this was going to be for the whatever, the Greek one, because Dr. Michael Morbius, for those of you who are aware of the character, is typically Greek, depending on who's telling the story, and he hungers for plasma. I was going to make that joke. I completely forgot, and I put these out of order. So that's just great. Just being trolled by myself without even realizing it. Goodness gracious. Okay, Yara-ma-yha-who. Now, there are different interpretations of how these creatures, what they're about, what they do, but this is an Aboriginal Australian creature, kind of adjacent to the vampire mythos. It's one of those weird ones. It's kind of an outlier because it's so weird. I added it here. I will say as well, before we get to the Yara-ma-yha-who, the Yowie, another uh, Australian Aboriginal mythological creature more akin to a Bigfoot and not a vampire. Like there was one Scooby Doo spinoff where I saw them making that. I was like, okay, you just clearly changed the lore to your liking. That's great. But the Yara-ma-yha-who is this, like I said, this very weird creature, so close to being vampire in a sense, but also being its own unique kind of entity. It's typically described as being exactly 4 feet tall, uh, but with this incredibly large mouth and head, like bulbous, like way bigger than a body would suggest. And it perches itself atop fig trees out in the outback, waiting for its prey to travel underneath them, and then it would jump down and swallow them whole as they have no teeth. If a victim attempted to escape, it would suck on the. Oh, that's why I had it there. I just remembered. Okay, yeah. We go back to our boy, Dr. Michael Morbius. There's suckers. Yes. And the Yara-ma-yha-who would latch onto them with those suckers. And it's so ridiculous. I'm sorry. I can't keep a straight face for that one. I need to be better about that. And it would use these suckers kind of like almost an octopus or a squid and keep them in place. They had it on its fingers and toes. Like other times when they were encountering people, they would go through this session of swallowing the person whole, not eating them like they normally would do, but merely suck the blood dry from them. Sometimes even leaving the victim alive just enough. If they had camped underneath its tree at night, and this is kind of a bit of a revenge, you think you can trample on my territory, it would then vomit the person out of its mouth and return later on to fully consume them. Some people would actually make it out alive in some of the tellings of the mythologies here. Very fascinating experience. But we'll have to move on there. That's the Yara-ma-yha-who of Australia. We'll go from there to the Philippines, to the Aswang. And you would see these beings flying through the night in the Philippines is this creature known as the Aswang, which appears to its victims as a beautiful and captivating young woman. Part witch and part vampire, the Aswang lived among its fellow villagers during the day, but at night used special magical ointments to gift themselves with power to attack people and sustain themselves with their blood. It's kind of a hybrid in most of the mythologies for the Aswang of a witch slash vampire. You also see sometimes in Spanish Mexican mythology and Portuguese mythology, you have the bruja or the bruxa, My Witcher fans will know a little more about that one, of a witch vampire kind of hybrid that needs blood to survive, but is not fully a vampire. They're not. I mean, they're more a witch that has vampiric traits. And what the Aswang would do, which is way different than everything else here on this list, is it had this unnaturally long tongue, and it would land on people's houses, stay on the roof, and then use their tongue to enter the home and slash open the jugular just enough to lap up the blood that came out. Sometimes this would kill the victim, sometimes it would leave them just alive enough. And then at dawn, the transformation would end and they would appear just as human as everyone else. So that was that big thing. You could never know who was an Aswang and who wasn't. In fact, in the midst of the 50s, there was a big militia group that was being targeted by the government at the time. And they were perceived by the locals, the natives, as an Aswang because of how they killed people in the night. It's very fascinating stuff. I highly recommend you guys want to look up more. Like I said, I'm not going into everything here, but please check these things out. They are well worth your time. In fact, look at the sources I'm going to give in the description for this video for some of the books I read. Next up on our list is an African vampire known as the Adze. This is, let me make sure I get my pronunciation right. According to the mythologies of the Iwe, I think it was Iwe people, and I apologize if I got that wrong. They hail from Ghana and Togo in Africa. The Adze is a being that can take on the appearance of a firefly to seem kind of harmless, and when no one's looking, it shifts into the form of a human. And in this state, they possess men and women so that they have a safe kind of body in a village where they could just go in there completely unmolested. No one would think oh, my neighbor's here. And they would think nothing else about it. But at night, while it was traveling around in the form of the firefly, the Adze would suck blood from its victims while they slept. Typically, this would lead to their deaths. Now, this is a lot of anthropologists have looked at this and they kind of come to the conclusion that this is a way of explaining a death via mosquitoes through malaria. I don't know if the tsetse fly goes up this far north in Africa. I want to say no, but citation needed on that. That could be an explanation as well. So you can see, just out of these five, the variety of vampiric lore we get from all over the place. It's astounding. But are vampires real? Is it possible for there to be a being out there supernaturally enhanced to come back from the dead, drain the blood from people, make more of itself? Who knows? Let's figure that out together. So, what are some explanations of what could be happening with vampires? Why would people think they exist? Well, as people, we've always been fascinated with the idea of death. And every now and then, uh, a body would need to be exhumed from a coffin, and people would notice that they weren't decomposing the way other corpses did. And this could be for a myriad of reasons. This could be because of the environment they were in or the time of year that it was. And the body wouldn't decompose in the same way as someone who had been laid down in the winter or the spring or what have you. And so people look at the bodies and go, "Whoa, they look like they're full. They look like there's blood and fluid coming from their lips. And then their nails are unnaturally long. Are they growing? And then their teeth as well would get a little sharper." And what we've come to find out later on is that it's not so much the nails getting longer as the skin is retracting due to natural states of decomposition. The body is not full because it's being fed, but it's more the gases inside as that corpse is decomposing start to expand a little bit more. And there's other explanations as well. So that's one possible one. It's just humans misunderstanding natural decomposition. In fact, if you would go back to what I discussed at the very beginning of this video, that's one of the reasons that the archaeologist who found this woman and the anthropologist is that the reason she had a brick in her mouth is because not only were people dying of the plague, But they needed someone they could give as a scapegoat. And they go, oh, well, judging by her decomposition, and obviously they didn't have the same terms as we do then. This was 16th century Venice, not, 21st century Venice. They saw, oh, she's not like the others did. There's something wrong with her. She must be a vampire. And they put the brick in her mouth to hopefully like stop the spread of the plague because I mean they don't have the knowledge that we do. And as time goes on, people have superstitions about a lot of things. But it's based on a lack, some of it is based on a lack of knowledge. So that's one possible explanation for why she would have been given, even at such an old age, this brick forced into her mouth, even after she's already dead. Then we go to tuberculosis, also known as consumption. And this is one of those diseases, thank God we are living in the age that we do now. For thank God for cleanliness overall, for food and water being prepared in better ways, people have better access to them, for the vaccines and the medicine that we have now that can help prevent this from spreading in the way that it did. This was another form of a plague. The bacteria that would just get in people and infect them and cause this wasting disease was one of the most horrific um, epidemics in the entire history of the world. And because he was so prominent, this disease was considered to be somewhat supernatural in the idea that if one person in the family got it, well, the others would as well. And not knowing about how diseases spread or viruses or bacteria or what have you, the superstitions rose up. Say, oh, well, this first member of the family died, then the rest all followed suit. That they must be rising up from their grave and infecting the other members of their family and killing them too. Like that sounds unreasonable to our modern ears, but we have the advantage of having science, of having a lot of more study into how the body works and how diseases are spread, how to prevent that from happening than these people did. So it's certainly possible as something that could have caused people to think, oh, a vampire is here, especially with a disease like tuberculosis, consumption. Like the original sufferer, it seemed in their eyes like they were attempting to drain and consume the life from their family and friends to feed their own. And it's that idea is like it's not a stupid idea to think that based on the knowledge that you have. And we have this tendency when it comes to people of just, oh, the people in the past, they were dumb. Was like, what? Compared to us, yes. And you know why? Because they don't have what we have. So we got to give them a little grace, extend it their way. Another one for a possible explanation is anemia. Now, I'm not a doctor, so if I get any medical terms wrong, like let me know in the comments below, like, hey, idiot, this is what that actually means. I'm okay with that. Just word it better than how I did it. Anemia is something that can, really, it's more genetic, is something that can leave the sufferer with low counts of either red blood cells or hemoglobin. And over time, it causes that person to grow pale, lose stamina, suffer from fatigue, and they can even, at some points, it can induce fainting at times. So people see people wasting away from this. They don't understand what's going on, all the processes. And then sometimes those people would look a little better. Well, how is that possible? And accusations being thrown around as they were, but obviously they have to be draining someone else's life force, and they have to be draining someone else's blood, so on and so forth. And you see how those superstitions arrive and arise. So that's a possible origin of the vampire myth. Another would be good old sleep paralysis. Now, thank God in the heavens, I have never once suffered through this. I never want to. As someone who does a lot of research into, demons and shadow people and the Hat Man and alien abductions, like this is one of those catch-all terms people just throw around, kind of like with the what's that one stupid crane or whatever that people always like to bring up with Mothman. Uh, yeah, that one. I hate that crane so much, and it's done nothing wrong except people use it as an explanation for like, oh, well, obviously people think this giant winged figure was actually a crane. Like, no, that's not how things work. But sleep paralysis could be used as an example for what is sleep paralysis. I've explained that poorly. It is a moment when the body is in natural REM sleep. You're supposed to kind of be paralyzed because one thing reason people think that we're supposed to be paralyzed in that sense is because we're dreaming during REM sleep. And our body could move in a sense to where we act out portions of our dream, and what we have been biologically changed to do over time is prevent that from happening. But if someone were to wake up in the process of REM sleep, they're still in that hazy, like dream state to where they imagine figures there. There's plenty of examples across time of people thinking that there's a witch at the foot of their bed or a demon lying on their stomach because, oh, why am I not moving here? Something must be using magic or using its own presence to prevent me from moving. And that's, once again, one of those things that come about of they don't have the knowledge that we do of how to explain certain things. So it had to make something up. And sleep paralysis can cause people to see things that aren't there. They're hallucinating. They're, once again, are already in that dreamlike state. But not every person who's been paralyzed at sleep has seen a vampire over their bed or has seen a gray about to abduct them to an alien. Like some people are still moving around. So that's not a perfect explanation of how to get rid of the idea of any of those things. Now we go into a bit of a broader topic, and that's what could cause vampirism. And it could be the result of a curse or magic. And how very unscientific of you, Christian. Well, we're dealing with a very unscientific topic. Like, show me some grace that way. Vampires aren't supposed to exist in a rational world. But if it's possible for them to exist, how could it happen? We have to ask those questions. And for them, this idea of undeath is a curse to those of us in this world. We are designed uh, after the fall to live, die, and be in eternal glory or damnation. Sorry, and I know there are other people out there who don't think that way. So if you have another view, that's fine. That's just how I'm bringing it to the table. So this act is a defiance of still being around when you should be in judgment. Is some of the typical ideas for how the lore could have happened. But like, let's say vampires are real. This could be a reason. Is this curse of undeath keeps them around in this form of not half-life or anything like that, but like close, but not there. And they have to use blood in order to survive. Blood being one of the purest things in the world. That's why when animals were sacrificed back in the day, they would drain the blood out because blood is life. And a vampire feasting on blood is antithetical to the idea of what a sacrifice is supposed to represent, of what life is supposed to be. So they're cursed to be in this state of undeath, doing these evil practices forever and ever. And we also have to go into magic. Now, do I think magic is real? Absolutely. I mean, I've read my Bible. I see that Jonas and Jambres, the magicians in Pharaoh's court, were able to replicate some of what God could do through evil magic. I see, what is his name? Good old Balaam? Balaam? Yeah. Uh, and prophesying before he even met uh, the king of Moab and bringing stuff like this. So we had to have some alternate means. We had the witch of Endor. And was it actually Samuel's spirit that she conjured up, or did God allow Samuel's spirit to be there? Like, judging by her reaction, I'd say she's either a shysta or she was expecting something else to take his place, like a demon or something like that. Because I think it was actually Samuel's spirit brought by God, but that's its whole separate issue. So you bring up this idea, and it's a tough one too, because how do you go about proving a curse or magic exists? Well, it's going to be rough, real rough, but it's possible. And once again, as we get to our final judgments here, where do I stand? Well, I view this as something possible. Like there are tons, and once again didn't go over every case of vampirism in the world, Just through folklore alone, we could do 3 hour, 4 hour video. And then we get into actual cases of vampires being reported in Britain. We have vampire panics in New England and the Balkans. We have, I mean, Greece and so on and so forth. We didn't even go over the Jiangxi in China. Like, there's so much lore out there. There's so much. But is it possible for any of those to exist? Yes, I will say it's possible. Is it probable? That's where we get a little, I don't know. Probably no. But think, is it possible for there to be beings out there that live in this form in between true life and true death, that feast on the blood of others? I hope not. It'd be real bad if that's true. But what if? And with that, what do you believe, dear listeners and viewers? Are vampires real? A hoax? A fanciful bit of mythology and folklore? Or something else? We didn't touch on everything that the night has to offer us this evening. So let me know in the comments below if there's something you'd like us to do a follow up on. Would you like me to do more variants of vampires out there in the world? Would you like me to do psychic vampires and energy vampires and stuff like that? I'm up to the task. As well, in the description below, you can find the sources used for tonight's program. Next time on Friday Night Frights on September the 8th, we will be moving on to our next category, religious strangeness, where we will be discussing the possible whereabouts of the lost tribes of Israel. I'm so ready for that. Hope to have more of my fellow systematic ecology hosts there for that one. It's going to be a fun time. I'm looking forward to it. But remember, we are all a chosen people, a geekdom